So I personally appreciate that because I had already forgotten some things that we talked about in the morning yesterday. But so that was really, really helpful. So
I've got all of the talks on here, so if anybody wants to unpack any of them,
pull something up.
we can,
Okay.
we can open up any one talk and we've got all the
Okay,
slides.
great. So we have a little bit of time before we technically are supposed to leave. And I'm sure, anyways, we can always wrap up early. But what I wanted to do is make sure and give everybody an opportunity, if anyone at the table specifically, just to kind of start talking a little bit about some of the cross-cutting themes or anything that you've kind of picked out. I mean, and maybe we're done with this and maybe we're all ready to go home. That's okay too. But looking for some cross-cutting themes and what were some things that started emerging, where do you see us coming? If anybody has any comments about that, I'd also be interested if anybody feels like we really neglected something, and you brought up a couple issues like with the measurement methods, that we didn't really get into that a great deal. But anything that sort of struck you just sitting through the 2 days of, wow, we never mentioned this area, that would be interesting to maybe have a little conversation about. And then I also want to specifically ask everybody still back there in the back, make sure you guys know if you have any questions or comments or anything that you would like to contribute as we wrap up. Please just come on up there. So I'll just look around. Is anybody? We don't have anyone. We may wrap up early. Any comments? Yep.
Just want to mention that I think in this field the Hawks processes are quite new, so I'm really impressed that you consider them well known. So I thought that was a new method, but as I said, maybe they are well known in this audience. Thank you.
Yep.
One thing that I think might be helpful as you go on is, what are the constraints of some of the theories or practices, whether it's this can only work for individuals, this can work for groups of this size, whatever, but then do a what if, or is there a possible way to go beyond that, or to test what's beyond that boundary? So we perceive a boundary of this is for individuals, but what's the next, how would we extend that to a small group or to a larger group or something like that?
I just wanted to pick up on something Randy said, and that was the shortage of discussion on methods issues. Because not so much on the cognitive side, I think there were a lot of cognitive methods discussions, but on the non-cognitive side, we find that we end up using these rating scales. And just a small change, like instead of a rating scale, use a preference scale, is the basis for TAPAs. And now all of a sudden, you have an operational personality assessment. I mean, it seems like a trivial change. Instead of 1 to 5, it's this or that, and all of a sudden, and not only that, but by that small change, there's, I was thinking of Dave Bartram's work, cross-cultural work, where he shows that a preference format gives you reasonable national level correlations with variables such as the global competitiveness index and so forth, and conscientiousness, whereas the rating scale, the kind of Costa-McRae type data, gives you kind of ridiculous relationships, such as a minus, 30, 40, 50 correlation or something like that. And so that's just that's one change. But what about the whole idea of using performance measures? For example, Larry James tried this, to use a performance measure to measure personality. And certainly that, I would think, would be an important area of pursuit, even though we might not have the solutions today, to get beyond the rating scale and get into kind of performance measures of some of these concepts that are practical in a, let's say, selection context. Doesn't have to be, leaderless groups and these kind of very expensive procedures. It could be conceivably practical.
it strikes me that much of the way our measurement is done for brevity and how much bang can you get for a 10-minute buck, right? And it may well be that, you know, that's the best we can do. But, you know, you mentioned Larry James. Larry James is my colleague and a wonderful colleague, and he's doing this stuff now that's almost Freudian, and it took him a long time to agree with my assessment of that. This conditional reasoning stuff, but he's got validities of like 0.6 for aggressiveness, and so doing studies like he assessed every intramural basketball player at the University of Tennessee when he was there at the beginning of a season, and predicted the number of rough fouls, the number of times that the kid was thrown out of the game. I mean, incredible stuff at a like 0.5, 0.6 level, but those assessments take time. And you know, you find the same thing. You find the same thing with cops of bad shootings, but those assessments take time. And at some point, you know, we just have to come to grips with this. Are we willing to require a little more time to get a better, you know? But that's a financial estimate, isn't it, Jay? Or, you know, those are things that.
It is, but and to follow up, you know, I think there's potentially a lot of promise in pursuing something like a performance-based measure as a way to measure personality or cognitive abilities or a number of other abilities. I mean, there's stuff that we could get at, and Alina had referenced it in terms of using serious games and simulations as a measurement platform. With reference to Larry's, you know, the conditional reasoning tests, the thing that I'm actually most troubled by is of the 6 attempts or 6 developed conditional reasoning tests, Larry's 2 are the only ones that I know of that work. The other 4, and I developed one of the other 4, don't work. And it confounds all of us who tried and failed as to how in the heck did he do that?
Well, yeah, and I think that probably should concern all of us. And it, you know, he and I have become, I hired him. I flew up to Tennessee and said, come to Georgia Tech, you know, we need you back. And, but his argument is that there's a great, he will spend 3 weeks coming up with a single item. But until he can, or somebody can tell us how to make these items algorithmically, you know, then that instrument will not be useful to the world. I would submit, but you know, he's clearly measuring something. I've sat through these things, you know. I've seen him give this to my faculty when I was chair, and I predicted perfectly who were going to be the ones who would shoot me if I turned my back on them, you know. But yes, that's a very important issue.
Hello, it's Deirdre Knapp again from Humro. I want to follow up on Pat's comment about ratings, that kind of thing, and the criterion. So in the research that we're doing, following up, tracking soldiers who have taken the TAPAs when they came into the service, we're using ratings to get at some of those non-task performance kinds of things, like indiscipline and peer leadership, those sorts of things. Those ratings are not very reliable. And it's we think we'd get stronger relationships if we could get a more reliable criterion, but the options for how you assess those kinds of things other than ratings from others is pretty difficult. So one of the things the committee might think about is what could basic research do to help on the criterion side as you're looking at how well these wonderful new predictors would work.
Hi, my name is Ed Dieterle, and I'm a senior officer for research at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Also, to build on the discussion around non-cognitive factors, one of the tasks that I have at the foundation is to think about how we can measure non-cognitive factors among the 50+ million students that are currently in the K-12 education system. The original reviews that I did in looking at studies that were sponsored by IES, by Mathematica, and by individual professors point out that the way that the data is collected is through student self-report. And the first question I had was, all right, well, where are the other studies that use alternative methods? Digging deeper into the literature, I was able to find things that used observation or teacher report about students. Working with the other members of our research team, we set off asking the question, how are we going to measure these things? When we announced that we were interested in better understanding engagement and also academic tenacity, the first question that people would ask us centered around how are we defining it? And we said, well, wait a minute, let's put a pause on trying to wordsmith the definition, because there's so many different theories and definitions out there. You know, let's not try and invent yet another one. Let's hold the phenomena of interest constant and allow the measurement technique and discipline to vary. So in the fall of 2012, we brought together a cross-section of different researchers from all different kinds of disciplines to look at how one measures non-cognitive factors. We invited people from the neurosciences, from the computer sciences. We invited social psychologists and education researchers, as well as education leaders, to keep us honest. One thing that I'd like to encourage this committee to do is to think about how other sectors, for example, education, and also other disciplines who maybe are not represented in this particular panel, say, for example, the computer science community, think about this phenomena of interest, because it's likely to be the big step forward is going to come when we have the conceptual collision of different disciplines and different sectors coming together. Thank you.
Anybody else flagging down to make a comment? Pat? No? Yes?
I just wanted to, the last two questions had to do with the criterion space. And yes, everyone knows that the criterion problem is a big problem. But I think that we say that, but we don't constantly keep it in mind. And the example that springs to mind is Norm Fredrickson's American Psychologist article, 1980s something, where he talked about rifle assembly training. And he said that there was complaints about the abilities of the soldiers to put together assembled rifles in the field. And so what they did is they changed the test in training from multiple choice to rifle assembly. And as a result of that training, the desks were removed from the training room, and the whole structure of training changed as a result of that final outcome test, as a result of the change in the criterion. And the reports of assembly problems out in the field radically diminished. Same thing you can imagine, there have been a number of studies that have shown that some of the new cognitive predictors were adding incremental validity, but not to the traditional first term or basic military training grade or the first term technical training grades, which was a typical criterion. So Jan Collis, for example, did a study where the new predictors, the information processing predictors, outperformed the ASVAB, but only when the outcome was a performance outcome. And so this is just a historical study. It had no impact because we don't use that outcome. And so we are starting to think about attrition. Randy mentioned it in his comments, but we also should put a lot of time thinking into, a lot of thought into that criterion problem and how we could have innovative measures that are not going to be better than the ASVAB, because if we validate them against our traditional criteria, they're not going to beat. ASVAB was optimized to predict that criterion. So we should think about performance as Deirdre was mentioning in her question, that whole issue of putting performance measurement in the criterion space as well.
Good. Want to give our ARI guests one more chance if anybody wants to make any comments. Otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to Jack for a few minutes. Andrew, you look like you really want to say something. No?
He's been so
I do, yay. Are you sure? Last chance. Okay. I'm going to turn it over to Jack then.
Actually, let me
Oh,
have
wait,
one
oh,
quick.
sorry, Jay.
That's okay. I wanted to give them an opportunity first. The one thing I'd follow up on in terms of what Pat was saying and what Deirdre explicitly brought up, and this almost came up a little bit earlier in the team's discussion. And this is something that I would actually like the committee to at least consider at a superficial level and decide whether to go deeper on. You know, one of the biggest challenges that we have in our criterion measurement is actually getting to what the Army considers to be our ultimate criterion, which is combat effectiveness. The biggest challenge with that is getting researchers out there into combat to measure it. And it reflects the same kind of a conceptual problem that a lot of folks in teams research have been studying or have been struggling with. And that is, how do you actually capture stuff in a way that's fairly efficient from the team's perspective? And the direction that they've been going is to look at unobtrusive measures. There's a lot of challenge related to picking up what is essentially trace measurement in a variety of different ways and making sense out of it in relation to specific constructs. And if there's something that the committee has to say on that particular front in terms of unobtrusive measurement and trace measurement, I think we would very much enjoy hearing what you have to say on that.
What a great segue.